favourite Greek words actually would be souvlaki.
Yes.
And I had a really good one the other week, and so that's all I'm thinking about. And maybe second to that is halloumi.
Well, welcome back to the Sunday Monday podcast for another episode.
Mate, it is brilliant to be back. It's always good to get to episode 2. We got through the pilot.
We did.
People listened, and we're back again.
Yeah, I'm excited. We had a few listeners too, which is exciting.
A lot of listens.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Thanks for listening, and maybe you could subscribe as well. If you don't want to miss an episode, hop on that socials, wherever you get good podcasts from, wherever you're listening to right now, actually. Just hit that subscribe. That's always fun.
It's good, mate. It's, you know you've made a commitment when you hit the subscribe
That's
button.
right.
It's like I'm in now.
It's good.
Yeah,
but we're joined
excellent.
today by not just 2 preachers, 3, because you preached as well.
I did,
Sam.
mate. I did, yes.
But we're joined by the one and only Jessica Elsmore, who preached at Mackenzie 5 p.m. Welcome, Jess.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be here.
Glad you're here. And also Sercs again from the city.
Great to be here.
He's back.
Yes.
Mate, I think...
Can't get away from Roman sex.
No.
well, you did write the series. So, you
Yeah,
know,
I did.
You are the 20,000-foot level man.
Yeah,
on
well, when we
everything
say
Romans.
write the series, it was, yes, Romans from 20,000 feet.
We know you didn't write the letter. You wrote the series based on the letter.
Not a chance.
Very good. Hey, our first segment. But actually, we're adding a segment this time. We thought after last week, it'd be good to do a tight 2. Just a short summary of your message from yesterday or last night. Try and keep, I'll get a timer going in case it blows out to being the full sermon itself. But Jess, why don't you kick us off? 2-minute summary of your message from last night.
Yeah, cool. Well, I think, in many ways, Paul in this chapter and the whole book of Romans is confronting people to the reality of their sin and their position with God to then demonstrate how good the news is, that he's presenting the good news of the gospel. And so last night we were reminded of our position before a righteous and a just God and how we all fall short. But the good news is that we have receive in Jesus the gift of God's righteousness. It's not just something we receive, though. It's something that is active in us and continually growing as we become more like him. And the idea of being justified freely, we spent a bit of time unpacking that idea of, that visual that Paul gives us of the courtroom and how, God steps down and meets us where we're at, and just the joy of that. And
Brilliant.
It's great.
we landed in a good place. It started confronting, but we, landed in this is good news.
Like the passage does.
Yeah,
it's good.
exactly.
That was a tight 1. Well
Yeah,
done.
Oh, look at
a minute,
that.
7 seconds, Jess.
2 was so tight, it was
Beat
a 1.
that,
There you
Sercs.
go.
I'll try.
You can try.
Challenge extended.
It was a great message last night, Jess. I reckon it can be a dense topic, this stuff in Romans, but you actually brought a lot of lightness and hope in it, which I thought was really good. Yeah.
Well done.
Great.
Sercs, no
Wow.
pressure. You've got to beat a minute 7. Can you do it?
Well, I'll try. It's hard trying to summarise what Luther calls the greatest piece of writing in Scripture, Romans chapter 3. And I think, Jess has really summarised it really well. Just this whole idea that God's righteousness, that God's holiness and purity, that has been revealed through creation, through covenant, and ultimately through Christ. God's righteousness is revealed. And his righteousness, as I explored yesterday, reveals our unrighteousness. And exploring, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about this, about the nature of sin and what that means for us, our unrighteousness in the light of God's holiness and purity. But then the beautiful news, the good news, the gospel that Jesus is King, that he has defeated sin and death, he reigns and he rules. And as part of that is that we are invited through his work, as Jess was saying, is that we're actually justified through his redemption and through his atonement, his work of atonement for us on the cross, and how good that is. And probably where I landed was, stop resting on your own self-righteousness. Trust God's righteousness. And probably landed in that place, we have this tendency to go to gospel plus living. We, for those of us who have said, yes, we acknowledge the good news. We have placed our trust in Jesus. This, I know in my own life, but I think for many of us, we have this disposition to go gospel plus we go back to works righteousness, which Paul is railing against.
Yeah.
And so that reminder for all of us to continue to live by faith alone, in God's grace alone, by faith alone, in Christ alone. So, yeah.
Mate,
Well done.
exactly 2 minutes. 1 minute 57.
157.
So,
There you go.
that's pretty
That's
good.
good, mate. Well, before you hit start, I've got to give a little bit
Oh,
of...
true. You preached as well.
Oh, well,
so-
I preached as well, but this was week 1 for us. I
Yeah.
preached this passage, but it was week 1, so I did a bit of intro work
Okay.
on Romans.
Well,
but
here's your
once I got
type
through
two.
that, thanks, mate.
Ready, you go.
When we get to the next segment of what we left on the cutting room floor, I left a lot of the big theological terms on the floor and spoke in 2 metaphors or 2 pictures. The first one was the courtroom, and I talked about a lot of the terms Paul uses, which you hinted at, Jess, are judicial. And we stand before a judge condemned. But the beautiful message of the gospel is the penalty is paid by someone else. But what I really wanted to emphasise, and I was excited to see people getting a hold of this. I think a lot of people, their understanding of the gospel is limited to forgiveness of sin. But actually what Paul writes about is that we've been justified. So I carried on this metaphor of the courtroom, or this picture of the courtroom, and said, imagine the judge then summons you over after he's declared you guilty, but penalty paid, case dismissed. Judge calls you over and says, meet me outside in 10 minutes. So he meets you outside. He's in his civvies. His robes are off. And he says, come with me. You get in his car. It's a really nice car because he's a good judge. And he takes you out to the countryside and takes you to his mansion. You get out of the car and he hands you the keys and he says, these keys open every door in that mansion. This is my home and I want to invite you in. I want to invite you to live in my home. Actually, I want you to join my family and I want you to partner with me. I'm inviting you into the work. And Paul will go on and talk about this, the work of making the world a better place. I want to invite you into that. And this is justification. And then that mansion metaphor, like forgiveness is like the front room of the house that a lot of us Christians live in and don't want to explore the rest of the mansion.
Yeah.
There's a whole mansion to explore what it means to be a fully fledged son or daughter of the King. Where I landed then after that is I went to the parable of the prodigal son. I think Jesus' parable beautifully carries the weight of what Paul writes in Romans 3. Jesus carries that weight in a simple story. Yeah. I love that he does that. Like Paul's the big theologian, heavy stuff, and then Jesus just tells a story and everyone goes, I get it now. So yeah, that was my message yesterday.
And 1 minute 53. So
My goal
well
was to
done.
beat Cirque, so
Yeah.
I'm happy with that.
Well done. No, that's great. Wherever you might be joining us from, if you want to jump on our socials to get the podcast,
Yeah.
like I think every campus has a podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. So just search for Gateway Baptist Church, your campus. I'm sure you'll find what you're looking for in any of those
Absolutely.
spaces. So
That brilliant tight too. That's a good segment. We'll stick
Yeah,
with that.
that's
Which leads to the next segment, and it's a fascinating question based on those short summaries. What did you leave on your study room floor? What made it on your whiteboard or into your notes or into your laptop that you went, this is really good, but I haven't got time? 6.
Yeah, I found myself throughout the day having to cut things. I love I loved exploring, and I had to cut a lot of this. Just how God does reveal His righteousness. I think that getting a picture of who He is so it gives us an image. And maybe we'll get to this. It's hard to fully understand the nature of sin without understanding what we've been created for and who God is and His holiness and His purity. And it is really hard to conceptualize who God is. But I couldn't dive deep into the nature of God's righteousness and His purity and His goodness. I couldn't, didn't have the time to do that yesterday. But the way in which, even as Paul, reveals and talks about how through creation and through His covenant with His people, and even diving into the story of Abraham, the story which he does talk about in chapter 4, as he talks about the ways in which he has persistently, graciously, faithfully loved His people throughout history. And the way in which He has been so gracious and kind will slow to anger and rich in love, as He reveals Himself, as He says to Moses. That's I think that so often we know Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And we'll get to that. But it's almost like we have this vision of God who is holding a stick, just looking to beat us.
Yeah.
And this has been used in this passage, I think, as a false understanding of God. But God is not like that. And I mean, the prodigal son is a picture of that. So starting and creating that picture and giving us a picture of who God is and how he's created us and what we've been created for helps us then understand how bad sin is, because it's the deficit of everything that he created us for.
Yeah, that's good. I love the Keller quote, and I use it every chance I get. The bad news is you're worse than you think you are. The good news is you're more loved than you ever dare imagine.
Yeah.
And that's the gospel. And there's an A.W. Tozer says, again, I don't know this word for word, but it's along the lines of that Isaiah 6 moment, you know, that when we stand before a holy God and understand who he is and understand who we are, there should be this cry of pain. There should be this cry of anguish, this cry of woe is me, that's quickly then followed by elation that then, this holy God reveals incredibly deep love and affection for me despite my sin. And that's all in this passage, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
What about you, Jess? What'd you leave on the study room floor?
Yeah. There was a lot. I think I remember right at the start of, kind of unpacking this and figuring out what to speak on, I saw this quote, which kind of makes me laugh a little bit because it is just a reminder of how dense this particular passage of scripture is. It says, rarely does the Bible bring together in so few verses so many important theological ideas. The righteousness of God, justification, the shift in salvation history, faith, sin, redemption, grace, propitiation, forgiveness, and the justice of God. I was like, cool.
You're like, thank you for choosing me to preach this passage.
Yeah.
So which one of those did you leave on the floor?
Literally. All of them. No. There was a lot, and there's just so much richness and so much goodness in what Paul is saying in this passage. But I touched on it a little bit, but something that I probably could have unpacked a bit more is that whole history of salvation and where the recipients of the letter that Paul was writing to were coming from. Like, he's speaking to the Jews and the Gentiles, who both have a very different understanding of the law and experience of the law. And even as Sercombe was just saying, you have to have an awareness of the problem and the weight and the magnitude of sin in order to realize how good the good news is. But the church in Rome were made up of people that had been in relationship with God in a way that they knew for thousands of years, and then the Gentiles who were just jumping on the bandwagon and we have the same access to God that you do, and the Jews didn't like that because for so long their relationship with God had been about works and working and striving to maintain this relationship that always felt just that little bit out of reach for them. And I think there's just a lot in that, and you can read that and go, oh, that's like a contextual problem, that's a Jew-Gentile thing. But I was just challenged as well how often we compare ourselves as Christians today, whether if you've been in church and in faith for a long time, there is that ease of, finding satisfaction in I know more, totally. Big words, I serve more, I have been at faith, been a believer for a longer time. And how often we find satisfaction in that in relation to newer believers or people that are different to us. And that's convicting. But I think there's a lot of beauty in understanding the history of that journey of how God has been continually revealing his salvation plan that is for everyone, and everyone is under the same boat, whether you've been a Christian a long time or you're new to faith. We all fall short. And I love what you said, Sam, about the parable of the prodigal son, because I agree. I think that just encapsulates it so beautifully in a way that people can understand and relate to really easily, both back then and now as well. And
yeah, that's good. You touched on something there, Jess, that I think is huge in this passage, particularly, and at the risk of putting something in the cutting room floor segment that maybe belongs in the something old, something new segment. I talked about two different types of self-righteousness. There's religious self-righteousness, and you talked about that, and we can easily fall into that. I did make the comment religious self-righteous people don't like churches that preach grace. And I very proudly said, so self-righteous religious people won't like Gateway Redlands or any Gateway campus. Yeah, that's like a badge to wear, by the way. But the other type of self-righteousness is licentious self-righteousness, and the younger brother in the parable goes out to live that way. Like I don't need to live under your roof anymore, Dad. I want to go and figure this out for myself, and I'm going to go and live this way. And obviously, he comes to a dead end path. But there's so many people living that way now. And Sercs, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. And we were talking a bit off air before about this idea that in 2024, talking about sin and actually telling people that before a holy God they're being, you wouldn't use this phrase, but being licentiously self-righteous. You think you've got it all figured out, but actually you're sinful. Why is that so hard to talk about these days?
I find it hard to preach on, I find it hard getting people to understand the nature of sin, because I think we've moved as a culture now in our secular world where, and I speak about this in my message, that we are our own authors of truth. And so by being self-authoring, where truth is located in the psychological self, and that's allocated to every person, there is a rejection then of any overarching narrative, any overarching truth, or any overarching claim. And so to talk about sin actually is offensive, because that's to say that your truth is wrong.
Yeah.
And that makes it really difficult. And so sin then becomes, we've got to find ways to talk about it, but sin becomes psychological. The reality is that sin these days feels like anything that cuts across someone's personal truth. Yeah. Because that robs people of what the goal and the God is, which is happiness and self-fulfillment. And so that's where I think we're at in our context, in our society. And it does make it a challenge. I mean, I have conversations with young people particularly, and they say, I am innately good. I know what is good. And so it is a real challenge. I think the truth still remains. We've just got to find ways to actually point, because the fruit of sin is still there. In fact, I think it's exacerbated in our world. We see in our society today climbing rates of anxiety and depression, like more than any time in history. And so we see the fruits of sin, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit more in Paul's articulation of what sin is in a moment. But I think we can still point to the fruits of sin. And I think you have to almost go there to help people understand what is actually at play.
Yeah, I remember we unpacked a bit of this in a previous role that I was in with chaplains. We got them in a room, 5x5 kind of meters, hung a whole bunch of small little T's from the roof, all the different heights. There's like hundreds of T's in this room for truth. That's your truth. You're looking for truth.
I was thinking like black tea,
green
like
tea.
No, you're doing the letter T.
The letter T,
right,
yeah.
gotcha,
So just like these little cardboard letter T's. And the idea was you've got to find the capital T. What is actually truth in the middle of all these smaller T's in the world in which we live? But not only that we put a hat on their head when they had a T right in front of their face, so all they could see is their truth right in front of their face. It was incredibly powerful, actually, a powerful example of we live in a world with so much quote-unquote truth, or my truth that I see, but in the middle of all those T's, we had this big milk crate capital T in the middle of the room where people are trying to find that capital T truth. It exists. There is an immovable capital T truth that we are all fallen short of this glory of God, verse 22, but the capital T truth that all are also justified by Christ. Yeah. We're trying to find that capital T truth, but we get so focused on our little t truths that sit right in front of our face, or the distractions of the world, that we miss the capital T truth in the middle of all that. There's something, particularly you preach to a young adult congregation predominantly on Sunday night, Jess. So I reckon there's something in that for them, that they're searching for the capital T truth, but to understand it, we have to come to face with our own sin, which is true.
And people don't like that. I think most people acknowledge that there is sin and evil out there, but the challenge is acknowledging it in yourself. Most people have a moral compass of that's evil, that's not good. but turning it back on yourself and acknowledging, even if I am a good person and do the best to do myself, to be right, do the right things and make good choices, there is that, it's coming to terms with and realizing that the depth of the fact that I fall short as well. It's not just out there. It's not just a problem out there, but it's internal as well. And I think that's what's quite confronting for people. But most people acknowledge that there is a moral compass and there's good and bad, but you can't pick and choose where that stops.
Which in itself comes from God. Like we have this imprint in us as humanity of what is good and what is right and what is wrong.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the point, is that yes, you do have a moral framework. Perhaps you just don't know where that's come from and how you've imbibed in a powerful way the actual Christian story.
It feels like a minefield, and without the Spirit of God working on people's hearts, what hope do we have? Like, because when we talk about evil, if I just think back to what you were saying, Sercs, in our culture today, it would seem like an evil thing to claim absolute truth. You're actually being evil because you're undermining people's own personal truth.
Yeah.
So you're evil for preaching the gospel, and for you to tell someone that their truth is wrong, if they've gone within themselves and they've declared their identity and they say, this is who I am and I'm going to live it out. If you stop me from doing that, or if you even appear to be trying to convince me that that's wrong, you're evil. So I mean, this series is called Good News.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think using the word identity is a powerful one in our age, and I think if I can take the conversation a little bit to that Romans 3:23, where Paul does talk about identity in some way. It says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God," and Paul is using the word sin there, hamartia, which is a Greek word used in Greek tragedies for a fatal flaw. But
don't geek out on the Greek too early, mate.
I know. Well, that's not my word yet.
Okay, good.
We'll get another word. But he's also come out and fallen short, which is the Hebrew understanding of missing the mark or falling short. What's the mark? And what Paul is saying is that, we have been created in the image of God for flourishing. The good news is that God loves us. He created us for a purpose, and that was to image him, to flourish and to enjoy creation and to live in relationship with him. That's our identity. That's our mark. That's what we were created for. And sin is the falling short of that. It's the self-deception which we see in the garden, which says, no, I'm going to become my own judge. I want to know what the difference between truth and evil is, and I'm going to live for myself. That's what sin is. And so often we misunderstand or misappropriate sin and talk about, it's being good or bad or moral or not. But it's so much worse than that. It's so much worse than that, because it's about not doing and being what God fundamentally created us for. And I think that once we get to that understanding, then we get to understand the gravitas of the brokenness of our life and the reality of sin.
I'm just thinking of the younger brother in the pig pen. Like, he's in the slop, and he's come to some kind of realization of everything you just said. This is not the life that is good.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so he starts to think, and going back to what I said at the beginning when I did my tight two, he makes a plan hoping to only get forgiveness from his father. His plan is to be among the hired workers. Like, maybe if my father will forgive me just a little bit, I could find a home there. And what he discovers, of course, is full reinstating as an heir, as a son, and welcome back into the father's home, where he'll flourish.
Yeah.
I feel like to I guess tie a little bow around what you were saying earlier. We do live in this cultural tide of personal truth and all that sort of thing, but there's a lot of people finding themselves in the pig pen.
100%.
They're in anxiety, depression, whatever it is. They're in the pig pen and they want to come home, and it's that to me is preceding this sense that we have that there's a new season dawning for Australian culture that could be revival.
Yeah, absolutely. Where salvation isn't about curating your own identity.
Where
that's salvation
right.
isn't about improving your social media feed. Or whatever that moral value is for our culture today. I'll fix my anxiety and my depression by just sorting myself out. No. You've been given an identity, and we'll get to that in Romans 8 too. That's but that's the freedom that comes.
I think it's an exciting opportunity for the church in this season of our culture.
Yeah. Well, we're going to keep moving on to our next segment, something old, something new. Chance for us to go, what's the timeless truth we've dug into, but something that God has been speaking to us new in the text that we've been reading. And I know for me, I must have read this a bunch of times, but there's the little line in verse 21 that says that the law and the prophets testify to this righteousness. I think that just came alive, particularly as you preached last night, Jess, that you really unpacked well that the history of the Jews, Gentiles, their history around all this stuff. And I was like, all of this doesn't just point to a system of being made right. It points to Jesus, who is the embodiment of that person made right. And I knew that in my head, but I had a new level of, that's all of it points to him. And it was just kind of the moment of, I should know that. Like, I do know that, but I've relearned it again.
Yeah.
Jess, you had some really good stuff around that law and the prophet stuff, justice. How is God all just? How is he loving? What was new or old in that for you?
Yeah. I think the idea of the justice of God is a tricky one that often makes people feel uncomfortable. And certainly that has been my experience of God's justice in my faith journey. I think people approach it in one of two ways. They see God as a judgmental rule dictator that just wants everyone to do certain things and like killjoy and angry. And then there's the other camp of people that maybe have grown up in the church, particularly in like an evangelical expression of church where you're taught God is loving and kind and compassionate. And the two seem so far apart from each other. And I think for me in the process of this work has been being reminded of the beauty of how the justice of God and the love of God work together. I think, as I look back, I remember a really key moment as a teenager coming to terms with the justice of God for the first time, because I had grown up in the church, hearing the Sunday school stories of Noah's Ark and all the fun animals and the rainbows. Yeah. And, you don't really talk about the fact that God wiped the whole earth and everyone died.
It's a great kid's story.
It's a great kid's story. I mean,
everybody died.
And now I'm a kids pastor and I do the same thing. But I remember in high school in a study religion class learning about good and evil. And one of the case studies was, I think it was Sodom and Gomorrah or something. It's these Old Testament stories that you never learn as a kid. And coming home from school that day, absolutely distraught because the God I knew did not seem like this God I read about in these stories that I'd never heard. And I remember being in tears to my mum going, Mum, this isn't the God I know and love. This is not a loving God and a compassionate God. And so, I think the justice of God is a really uncomfortable thing to think about. But once you start understanding how God's love can't actually exist without God's justice, and, we've been talking about it already, the whole idea of the depravity of sin and the realization of that is uncomfortable, but that just makes the good news better. And so I think for me in this process, just being reminded of the fact that God's justice is good news. And yes, we all fall short, but the good news is that he has made a way for us to be in right standing, that the wrath of God is turned away from us, but we have to acknowledge the wrath of God and the anger of God and the judgment of God in order to appreciate the love of God and how he has made a way for us to be in right standing with him. And, we unpacked that idea of the courtroom and, I challenge people to picture themselves as the defendant in that courtroom and, God is the judge and there's evidence about your life. And, there's some people who might think, I'm pretty good. Surely there's not that much evidence. Or there's some people that are really burdened by the weight of sin. And regardless of where you sit on that scale, God actually gets down from that judge's seat and says, I want to take your place. I take your place. I'll take on the punishment that she deserves. And that is really good news. And that is the love of God and the justice of God at work together. And I shared a quote from Timothy Keller, who explains it a lot better than me. he says, the wonder of the cross is that in the very same stroke, it satisfies both the love of God and the justice of God. The very same moment, it shows us that God is both the judge who cares enough about his world to set standards and hold us accountable to them, and the justifier who has done everything necessary to forgive and restore us. And I just think the relationship between those two things has come alive for me in a new way, and my experience of the justice of God is continually evolving, and appreciating that in a whole new way. Is that God, to be loving, has to be just, and God, to be just, has to be loving as well. Otherwise they don't work without each other.
Beautiful.
And I think that's been a really cool reminder for me in this process.
So good.
That's great.
That's great. What about you, Sercs? What's something for you that's old or new?
Man, there's a lot that I want to dive back into with what Jess was talking about. But I think that I just, for me, it was just a reminder of our disposition towards righteousness and works righteousness. I think I may have mentioned this last week, but Martin Luther said we need to preach the gospel every day to ourselves every day because we forget it every day. Yeah. And just the whole gospel plus thing that I mentioned before, that we just have this disposition to go back to earning. We just try and earn, and it's this false understanding of who we are. It's a false understanding of who God is, false understanding of grace. And so even for those of us who've been Christians our whole life, we still find ourselves coming to God saying, look what I did. I've earned it. And that's why this, this is so, one of the reasons why it's so powerful, this passage is because we are justified. And like what you were saying before, Sam, that justification is not just a one-off, but it has to keep working its way out. And, that leads us to the doctrine of sanctification as well, that we are being changed into his likeness. But it's that justification being worked over and over again. And again, it was just a reminder for me that the power of what Christ has done is not just a past thing, it's a present thing, and it's a future thing. In fact, the word justification is, let me use a theological term for a moment, is eschatological, because it is for the future. Because we read in Revelation, God is judge, as you were talking about, Jess, and just this, again, the reminder that justice has been done and justice will be done. Jesus will stand as judge over all. He will judge over all. He will judge the living and the dead, and he will make all things right. And that we have got to hold on to that for ourselves. And
Absolutely.
Totally.
Sorry, I'm preaching.
No, that's good.
But it is living in that truth, past, present, and future, which is such a challenge.
I do look forward to you preaching this at Mackenzie this week, which will be fun for all those listening from Mackenzie. But I think the thing that stood out for me is that this righteousness term is not just that hole in the human heart that needs to be made right. It is much bigger than that. It's this cosmic righteousness. Jesus has come to set everything right, that we would be in that vertical right relationship with God the Father, who's made us right through what Jesus has done. But the word itself, and we probably won't dig into this word Greek, but that righteousness word, that dikaiosune word, that means justice. It means this up and down, just being right with God. But between you and I sitting next to each other, we need to be right with one another. If that is true, that has cosmic implications.
Absolutely, because sin is cosmic.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's good. My something else, something new is a bit different to this, but still very much related. This was week one for us at Gateway Redlands, and I said last week on the podcast, it's so significant, the title of this letter. Like, God's so intentional. He came to us when Rome was in power. He came to us when all power was invested in, all human power was invested in Caesar. And Paul writes a letter to the city in which God says, I'm going to put a church there. Yeah. A phrase I used 5 or 6 times in my message yesterday was, Gateway Redlands, you are the best evidence to me that everything that Paul writes in Romans is true.
Yeah, wow.
And I said that with chills. I said that with tears in my eyes. I said that with much gratitude. I think the church cops a lot of flack these days. A lot of that is justified. Yeah. But where we sit, we are not perfect, but we're passionate. And I think I could say to every Gateway campus that the best evidence before my eyes as campus pastor that everything that Paul writes in Romans is true is my church.
Yeah.
And then I started to think, you can read history books about two things. One about the demise of the Roman Empire.
Yep.
You go to Rome now to visit ruins. You don't go to visit and pay homage to Caesar.
And eat pizza.
And eat pizza. Yeah, that's what I said.
And ice
Food
cream.
and tourism.
Gelato.
That's what you go to Rome for. These I haven't been, but maybe one day we'll see how this
Rome-
podcast goes. I have to
Rome is
monetize it. And then we,
I love
Rome's
Rome.
unreal.
Favorite European city, yeah.
It's
Now I
unreal,
wanna go back.
but there's ruins, right? And everything that
Yeah.
stood for power and the prestige of the Roman Empire is now ruins. But because God decided to plant a church in Rome, from there, Christianity a few hundred years later became the national religion. The church grew and flourished so much because of the stuff that Paul writes in Romans. And then I said to our church, God has planted us with a bunch of other local churches. We don't want to be, arrogant and think that we are the only one in the Redlands. There's heaps of gospel-centered churches in the Redlands. But he loves the Redlands as much as he loved Rome. And if he could do that to the world from Rome, what might he do with us here? So that's something old, something new, what he did back then.
Yeah.
Because Paul wrote this letter and taught and unpacked so much of this stuff and they became so gospel-centered. When I look at you, Gateway Redlands, I see the same thing. I see the same evidence. What's around the corner for us? That's exciting.
Yeah.
There's a real challenge in that, right? Like, I can imagine Paul writing this to the Roman church, who are made up of Jews and Gentiles, this real melting pot of people's background stories. And that's quite evident of our own churches. We sit around and represent here at this table, and anyone who's a Christian who listens to this, same as your church. I reckon for me, that's really stood out as the challenge in all this, that there is a challenge to, if we are the evidence of God's righteousness in the world, one, we've probably stuffed that up a whole bunch because we're sinful. But two, there's this call into being made right or being made righteous or continue that process, that sanctification process of being made right again daily, to show the world what it looks like to be made right with God and what the human flourishing can look like in that space.
Is that not the call of the church? Summarized
That's right.
very well. I mean, that was
Absolutely.
Israel's call.
Yeah.
And now it's the church's call.
Yeah.
We are meant to be reflectors of the glory of God to a watching world. And Romans says, the earth itself groans in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed and the daughters of God to be revealed. So there is this glory revealed in the church that we often make murky.
Yeah.
But at our best, glorious. We are glorious with our King. It's a massive challenge and
great.
a massissive encouragement.
Yeah.
Very much so. We've heard a few Greek words already.
Yeah.
A few good ones from you, Sir, because I know you've got some more up your sleeve. Jess, what's let's geek out in the Greek now. What's the Greek word you've brought to the table today?
One of my favorite Greek words actually would be souvlaki.
Yes.
And I had a really good one the other week. And so that's all I'm thinking about. And maybe second to that is halloumi.
Mark Dean, our producer, that's the grab for this episode, all right? That's brilliant. I love that. That's perfect.
I'm going to let Cirque take this one.
Yeah, good call. I would too.
Love that. Well done.
I am. Can I just say I am not a Greek expert here, guys.
You're the most qualified around this table, it seems.
Very much so.
Except in
listen,
food.
I just was. There was. We were geeking out in the Greek. There is a word that I think is incredibly loaded and rich,
Like a good souvlaki.
and like a good.
Amen to that.
Perfect.
Preach it.
But has probably caused a whole bunch of conversation, particularly recently as well. The word illusterion, which is in verse 25, and it's interesting. It is loaded and it is rich, and that's why I think different translations translate this word illusterion differently. The NIV, which I think is a quite helpful translation, says God presented Christ as illusterion, a sacrifice of atonement. Some Bibles will translate it propitiation, which is a very it's probably just as understandable as illusterion.
Yeah.
Some
It's all Greek to me.
Yeah, that's right. Some expiation, and others the mercy seat, and which probably speaks to the diversity, the richness of that word, and what Paul's trying to communicate as he's talking about atonement.
Yeah, so the word we would look at there is it's the sacrifice of atonement. That's what we're looking at.
That's right.
How does that harken back to the Old Testament? Do you have?
Yeah. So, and that's what Paul's doing, right? So he's reaching for language to go, how does justification work? And he gives two theological words here. He firstly is redemption. So he says we're redeemed, which is a commercial term. You buy it back. You pay, like a slave could buy their freedom by paying the debt. And so it's a commercial term, and it's one that we're familiar with in some level or not. But sin is so, as we've been talking about, the image of God and what we've been created for is so great, and sin has ruined that so deeply. And sin does do this. It's not, you can't just, sin is not just something that you can repay. You know, that it has a relational collateral to it. Trust is lost. There is brokenness. There is pain. You know, talk with people going through marital problems or relational breakdown, you know. And so what Paul is doing is he's grabbing hold of another way of understanding what God has done for his people, and he uses this word illusterion. He's pointing to a relational term, which is atonement, and which is a relational term, at one ment.
Yeah.
And so that's what God, by his mercy and grace, did for the people of Israel who could not uphold the law. And so he created a mechanism, a way by which sin could be located, sin that could not be repaid between Israel and God, could be located in an animal. And this is so foreign to us, right? But sin was located in an animal, in the Day of Atonement. That pure animal was killed, and the blood was spilled on the mercy seat, in order that sin was washed away, that sin was taken away, and so that people could be in relationship with God again. So it's relational atonement, and that's what. So Paul is taking that, what he's done, you know, for Israel. He is now saying, that's what God has done for us in the person of Jesus. Yeah. And that's the powerful thing. Like, you know, and so some people cringe when it's the word propitiation, because it is this. So propitiation means, to come back to that, the wrath of God is diverted through the death, through the punishment of Christ. And that's a challenging concept. And some people go, that's just not the nature of God. God is not a wrathful God. And then some use the word expiation, which is a washing word. It's a cleaning word, that our sins have been cleaned, they've been washed away. And the mercy seat is another way of understanding it, which is where, and you were talking about it beautifully before, Jess, is the mercy seat was where the blood was spilled. It's where God's mercy and his justice meet.
Yeah.
And that's why it's such a rich word, because it takes all of these concepts. And I think what's helpful for me in all of this is that with atonement, it's relational. But it's not about the person or the lamb, or you know, Jesus takes upon himself the sin of the world. So he is now the one who is taking. He is the atonement sacrifice, but he is absorbing all the sin, all the disease at a cosmic level, because only God could do that, right? And it's the sin he takes upon himself, and it's the sin that dies at the cross. It's the sin that is condemned, and it's the wrath of God against the sin that distorts what his intention was. That's good. And so that's how I understand that work of atonement being worked out. Is very rich. It's very powerful. It's also very foreign to us. I was thinking about it. Sorry, and I know I've prattled on for a bit, but I was thinking about that for me. I love my kids, but I see sin at work out in my kids, and you know, when I was thinking about this whole idea of, you know, wrath and sin and its pain. And its brokenness, and sometimes, you know, I hate, you know, if one of my kids is just cruel to one of my other children, but it's not that I hate either of those kids. My wrath is at them, but it's actually just seeing the sin that actually is being worked out, and that's where my anger, that's where my pain is located. And thanks be to God that he's actually made a way for that reconciliation, that relationship with us and him, and for us between ourselves, that's been
great.
That's why we geek out on the Greek, mate. All that from Illusterion, which also sounds like a great Marvel character.
It does, yeah.
No, that's that good one with Stan Lee.
Yeah, it's really good. Well, I think we're coming close to the end of our time today.
We are, mate. It's been
Jess,
rich.
It has been really rich. Jess, I know that you finished your message last night in a really beautiful way with a quote that I'm attributing to you. I think it's yours. It says, Practicing righteousness is our greatest witness to the world. And Sam, you've kind of touched on this with what that looks like for the Redlands. And I wonder if we just finish with a question today. A question for us around the table, a question for us at home is, how are we practicing that righteousness? How are we practicing it personally when we come face to face with the sin we have and we need to come to Jesus and be made right again, hourly, minutely? How are we practicing that righteousness within us? But how are we practicing it so the world can see it too?
Yeah, that's good.
I reckon that's a great question for us to ponder between now and when we meet next.
Yeah, brilliant.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us for another great episode. And thanks, Jess. Thanks, Andrew.
Great to be here.
Thanks, Brad.
My pleasure, Sam. It's been a fun day.
Has been.
Catch you next week.
Good on you.